Imagine being 17, wrapped in velvet and legacy. You were born under the chandeliered ceilings of an English estate, your surname inked in the ledgers of Parliament, your cradle carved in Italian mahogany. Your days are spent reciting Latin, your evenings listening to Vivaldi echoing through marble halls. You are the heir to a dynasty, old, proud, and unshakably rich. But one morning, a sealed letter arrives on your breakfast tray. No greeting. No explanation. Just a sentence written in your father's cold hand. It is time. Prepare for the journey. This is not a holiday. Not an escape. This is your rite of passage. It is called the Grand Tour. You are to leave England, alone. Cross the Channel, navigate the salons of Paris, the ruins of Rome, the canals of Venice. You are to study antiquity, philosophy, architecture, diplomacy. But there is a truth they do not speak aloud: this journey is not about what you learn. It is about what you survive. You will be tested not by exams, but by temptation, wine, scandal, seduction. You may fall into debt, into disgrace, into love with someone entirely unsuitable. And yet, your family expects you to return polished, worldly, and worthy of their name. Because in the world of aristocracy, one fact is undeniable. A man who has not completed his grand tour is not yet a man. And for some, that journey would become the most beautiful ruin of their lives. To understand the grand tour, one must first understand the world that demanded it. Europe, in the late 17th to early 18th centuries, was not just a map of kingdoms and borders. It was a mosaic of philosophies, a battlefield of ideas, and, for the aristocracy, a theatre of class performance. To be born into nobility was not enough. One had to perform it. And performance, like any art, required education, both formal and symbolic. Thus, the Grand Tour was born. It was not offered to everyone. It was a privilege, reserved almost exclusively for the sons of aristocrats, young men of blood and fortune, whose families could afford not only the luxury of travel but the long absence from duty. These boys were often between the ages of 16 and 21, sent abroad for 1 to 3 years. Their names, Cavendish, Wellesley, Byron, would later shape politics, literature, and war. But before they became history, they became travelers. The purpose? Ostensibly, education. But not the kind found in dusty classrooms. This was about absorbing culture, mastering diplomacy, refining tastes. They were to learn painting from Florentine masters, sculpture from Roman antiquity, and statecraft from the salons of Versailles. In England, it was seen as essential to becoming a gentleman. To skip it was to remain provincial, unformed, embarrassingly English in a world that prized French elegance and Italian sophistication. Fathers who had completed the tour expected their sons to do the same. It was not a choice. It was inheritance. Most grand tours began in Calais, the entry point to continental Europe. From there, travelers moved to Paris, where they were introduced to fashion, wit, and the intricacies of court life. A few months later, they would cross the Alps, an arduous journey, to reach northern Italy, home to Verona, Venice, and Florence. Eventually, all roads led to Rome, the eternal city, the capstone of the tour. But for the most ambitious, the itinerary didn't end there. They might continue to Naples, to gaze upon Vesuvius. Some dared to sail to Athens or Constantinople, stretching the bounds of geography and reputation alike. These were the bold ones, often romantic, sometimes reckless. To assist them, families often hired tutors or guardians, known as bear leaders. Their job was to ensure the young men didn't drink themselves into ruin or fall victim to petty theft, though many failed spectacularly at this task. And yet, there was something theatrical, almost religious, about the ritual. It was a pilgrimage of class. Every step, every ruin visited, every portrait commissioned by Italian painters was a marker of legitimacy. By the time a man returned to England, his luggage would be heavier with books, statues, silk, scandal, and, If his parents were lucky, wisdom. But the deeper truth? The Grand Tour was not only about becoming educated. It was about being watched. Every city was a stage, and the aristocratic youth a performer. He was being groomed for marriage, for political influence, for the responsibilities of legacy. And he had to prove that he could carry the family name through foreign temptations without collapsing under its weight. Not all succeeded. Some never returned. Others came back disgraced, disinherited, or changed beyond recognition. And yet, for centuries, the tradition endured. From the halls of Blenheim to the salons of Vienna, the Grand Tour was whispered like a spell, a sacred debt every heir had to pay. Because in the age of powdered wigs and ink-dipped quills, knowledge was not enough. Experience was everything. And Europe, ruined, romantic, and ruthless, was their classroom. For those who succeeded on their Grand Tour, transformation occurred. They returned not as boys, but as men adorned with culture, stories, and a subtle but unmistakable polish. They brought back with them more than just knowledge, they carried a new identity, one stitched together from centuries of civilization. Their gait slowed, more deliberate. Their tastes evolved, velvet replaced wool. Conversation was sprinkled with French aphorisms, and opinions were formed not from books, but from candlelit debates in the salons of Rome and Versailles. Among England's elite, to say, "he's just back from the tour," was the highest compliment. It meant, he had seen the world. He had survived its temptations. He had absorbed its refinement. This was the golden hour of the aristocratic youth. He was now desirable, respected, envied. Mothers of noble daughters whispered his name behind their fans. Portrait artists competed for his likeness. His letters were quoted in parlors. His French was effortless. His pocket watch Swiss. His shoes handmade in Florence. His views on architecture matched those of Palladio. More than anything, the tour gave him narrative value. He became a man with stories. Of riding horseback under Roman aqueducts, of narrowly escaping a duel in Venice, of attending a masquerade ball in Paris where a duchess mistook him for royalty. Wealth could be inherited. Land could be measured. But experience, earned experience, was something else entirely. The possessions they brought home were not merely souvenirs, they were symbols of their journey. Statues from Naples, books from Leiden, cameos from Florence. Many of these filled the great houses of England, Longleat, Chatsworth, Blenheim, establishing the interior aesthetic we now call old money elegance. Gilded frames, Greco-Roman busts, Corinthian columns, these were not simply decoration, but evidence. Evidence that the heir had passed his test. Those who excelled became fixtures of London society. They were invited to exclusive clubs like White's or Brooks's. They sat in Parliament with a slight air of condescension toward those who had never left British soil. They married daughters of dukes and princesses of the German states. Some became art collectors. Others diplomats. A few became legends. One of them was George Augustus Selwyn, a grand tourist whose wit and cynicism made him both feared and adored. He returned from his tour with a taste for satire and scandal, and found himself at the center of court gossip for decades. Another was Lord Byron, whose own tour was laced with forbidden romance, dangerous liaisons, and poetic inspiration. His time in Greece and Italy not only defined his literary genius but helped sculpt the image of the romantic hero, brooding, cultured, and untamed. But not all was as golden as it seemed. Behind the elegance of embroidered waistcoats and Venetian slippers, something more delicate stirred. A sense of superiority, yes, but also a creeping disquiet. Some grand tourists returned with a taste for pleasures that society could not condone. Others brought back habits, gambling, opium, affairs, that would haunt their adult lives. Still, at their peak, these young men were gods among mortals. They had seen the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and drunk wine in Roman ruins under the moonlight. They knew which olive oil to use, which composer to praise, which line of Virgil to quote in a duel. They were not merely rich, they were trained, seasoned, dangerous. Society adored them. But society also watched them closely. Because when you return from a journey meant to change you, society expects you to have changed for the better. And some didn't. Beneath the polished surface of a grand tourist's return lay the beginnings of a quiet war, one not fought with swords or scandals, but with expectation, inheritance, and silent despair. Because while the tour promised transformation, it also brought back something far less manageable, self-awareness. The young men who once obeyed without question now saw their father's authority through a different lens. They had debated Enlightenment thinkers in candlelit libraries in Lyon. They had walked through ruins that whispered of the collapse of empires. They had flirted with daughters of French libertines, who laughed at the English obsession with duty and honor. They returned home to castles colder than they remembered, mothers more controlling, and fathers who now expected proof that the tour had been worth it. And proof, in their minds, meant only one thing: obedience. You are back. Educated. Civilized. Now marry this woman. Manage this estate. Vote the way we vote. Become the man we designed you to be. And here the cracks began to form. Some resisted. Others crumbled. The contrast between the sensual freedom of the continent and the rigid conformity of aristocratic England was suffocating. Many felt as though they had outgrown the world they were supposed to inherit. Behind the thick walls of manor houses, tensions brewed. A son who questioned politics, or dared support revolution, was labeled unstable. A son who refused the arranged marriage with the daughter of another wealthy family was told he was ungrateful. A son who developed a taste for Catholicism, or worse, for foreign lovers, was called a threat to the bloodline. The same families who had once spent fortunes to send their sons on the grand tour now punished them for becoming what they had seen. Some young men tried to live dual lives. By day, they fulfilled their roles, managing land, attending parliament, marrying the proper woman. But by night, their souls wandered elsewhere. In secret clubs and private salons, they recited poetry about loss, drew sketches of Roman ruins, or corresponded with Italian courtesans from whom they had never truly parted. A few broke entirely. One such figure was John Addington Symonds, whose travels awakened not just an aesthetic appreciation for male beauty in Greek sculpture, but a truth about himself that Victorian England would never accept. His writings, though hidden during his life, would later inspire generations. But in his time, they brought only shame and exile. Others were consumed by their own contradictions. They had seen grandeur beyond England's borders, yet were chained to ancestral duties. They had tasted freedom, yet were expected to uphold legacy. They spoke the languages of the world but were forced to remain fluent in silence. And within that silence, madness sometimes grew. Mental illness was not spoken of in polite society, but it lingered in drawing rooms and hunting lodges, in the haunted eyes of heirs who laughed too loudly or drank too deeply. Melancholia, hysteria, nervous disorders, these were the polite euphemisms used in doctors' notes. In reality, they were signs of young men collapsing under the unbearable weight of appearances. Some were sent away again, but not to Rome or Paris. Instead, they were sent to sanitariums in the countryside. Others simply disappeared from public life, hidden behind closed curtains and whispered excuses. And then there were the stories that circulated in hushed voices at garden parties. The heir who shot himself in the library. The Viscount found drunk and naked in Hyde Park. The baronet who ran away with a violinist from Venice. Not all of them were true, but many were. And the more scandalous the fall, the more discreetly the family responded. In the world of old money, reputation was currency. It could not be allowed to devalue. So the pressure continued. And the gilded cages, though beautiful, remained cages. What the grand tour gave in spirit, society demanded back in submission. For some, the grand tour marked the beginning of their legend. For others, it marked the beginning of their end. The same journey that had once symbolized enlightenment and growth had, in many cases, planted the seeds of destruction. And once back in England, hemmed in by tradition, duty, and cold expectation, those seeds quietly bloomed into ruin. There was no single way aristocratic heirs fell. Some were devoured slowly. Others all at once. Take the case of Lord Henry Somerset, descendant of the powerful Beaufort family. He returned from Italy radiant, fluent in multiple languages. A patron of the arts, known for his charm and elegance. But there were whispers, even then, about his long absences, his preference for opera over parliament, his letters to a young Italian sculptor. When those whispers reached his father's ears, the response was swift. The family, desperate to preserve their image, forced him into an arranged marriage. But Lord Henry could not live a lie forever. Years later, he left his wife, his titles, and his inheritance behind. He vanished into Europe, into obscurity and disgrace, at least in the eyes of his peers. But it was not just scandal that destroyed these men. It was betrayal, from within their own blood. The very families that had once paraded them as future dukes and marquises were often the first to turn cold when they failed to conform. Some heirs were quietly written out of wills. Others were institutionalized under the guise of rest or moral correction. The Grand Tour had trained them to see the world. But society demanded they unsee it. And when they couldn't, when their minds refused to retreat into the safety of ignorance, they broke. Some turned to alcohol. Others to gambling. The gaming halls of London and Bath were filled with former Grand Tourists, their pockets stuffed with debt and their eyes dull with disappointment. Once praised for their eloquence, they were now pitied for their recklessness. In one infamous case, a young earl named Frederick Coleridge, who had studied sculpture in Rome and debated Rousseau in Geneva, was found dead in a boarding house in Soho, aged only 32. His cause of death, laudanum poisoning. His inheritance had long been squandered on wine, women, and bad investments. His family refused to claim the body. Even those who maintained the outward appearance of success were not immune. Behind the gilded doors of their country homes, some wandered aimlessly from room to room, reliving their continental days through fading memories and fading letters. They no longer belonged to the present, nor did they wish to return to it. The tragedy of the Grand Tour was not in its failure to educate. It was in its ability to awaken a hunger for beauty, for freedom, for meaning, that aristocratic life could never truly satisfy. It gave its heirs a glimpse of who they could become, and then chained them back to who they were expected to be. And in this tension, many were crushed. Some ended their lives in quiet despair. Others vanished from society entirely, forgotten, hidden, erased. But a few fought back. They wrote. They painted. They rebelled. They gave up fortune to chase fulfillment. Some became artists, scholars, or exiles. Their names may not be etched in the peerage, but their stories whisper through the museums and letters of Europe still. Because the Grand Tour was not only a journey through lands. It was a descent into the soul of privilege, and not every soul survived the fall. Not all stories of the Grand Tour ended in scandal. Some didn't end at all, they simply faded. Among the great estates of England, there are wings sealed shut, libraries with dust on foreign books. Portraits of young men with sun-kissed cheeks and Italian collars, and no descendants to explain who they were. They are the forgotten sons of old money. Some died quietly, without fanfare. In sanatoriums tucked away in the Cotswolds or foreign hotels where the staff no longer remembered their titles. Their names, once whispered at debutante balls and printed in society pages, slipped into silence. Like Edmund Hargrave, heir to one of Yorkshire's most powerful families, who vanished from the social register in 1794 after returning from Athens with a mysterious illness. He lived out his days in a cottage by the sea, collecting Greek pottery and writing letters to a lover who never replied. When he died, his family burned his journals. His name was never spoken again. Others found themselves trapped in quiet prisons of their own design. They remained in their family homes, technically present, socially invisible. They lived among the silver and the servants, but with no influence, no purpose. Their rooms became museums of former glory. Their days marked by silence and brandy. Their only companions, dogs, books, or ghosts from the tour. One such figure was Charles L. Montfort, who, after a dazzling grand tour and a brief stint in Parliament, withdrew completely from public life. He filled his study with Roman statuary, refused marriage, and rarely spoke. In his final years, he was referred to in the village as the Marble Man, a shadow who paced his garden reciting Virgil in the rain. When he died, his will left everything to a cathedral in Florence. Even for those who lived long, the Grand Tour became a distant echo, a relic of a self they could never fully reclaim. The world changed. Napoleon rose. Industrialization darkened the skies. The grand salons of Europe closed their doors. And the old aristocracy, once so assured of their place in the world, began to wither like ivy on a crumbling estate. By the mid-19th century, the Grand Tour was no longer fashionable. The rise of the middle class, steam travel, and modern universities made it obsolete. What was once a sacred rite of aristocratic identity became a faded curiosity. And so, the last true grand tourists died quietly. No headlines. No monuments. Only rumors. Some say one of them, Reginald Beauclerk, never returned from Constantinople. That he changed his name, married a dancer, and died under a different sun. Others believe he built a hidden library of Grand Tour diaries beneath his family estate. Sealed behind a false wall, an archive of forgotten lives no one dared read. What remains now are fragments. A cracked marble bust in a country house. A portrait in a museum, its subject unnamed. A dusty travel journal sold at auction, written in a hand no one recognizes. And yet, in these quiet remains lies something greater than tragedy. There is a kind of haunted nobility in the fall of the grand tourist, a reminder that privilege does not shield the soul, and that even those born into castles must still fight to find themselves. Their downfall wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was simply a slow vanishing. The sound of footsteps fading down a marbled corridor. A curtain blowing gently in an empty Venetian room. A candle burning low beside an unopened letter. We often speak of wealth as permanence, castles, heirlooms, names carved in stone. But the truth is, even the grandest fortunes come with a clock ticking in the background. The young men of the Grand Tour were born into everything. And yet, many of them returned home lost. Not for lack of money, but for lack of freedom to remain changed. They were sent into the world to be sculpted by culture, beauty, danger, and wisdom, only to be demanded, upon return, to forget all they had seen. To shrink back into the mold prepared for them. Some obeyed. Others paid the price for refusing. But all of them remind us of a question that still lingers across centuries. What happens when the journey shapes you into someone your world no longer recognizes? In today's world, we chase experience, travel, growth, exposure. But have we truly escaped the chains of legacy and expectation? Or are we simply walking a more modern version of the same path, seeking ourselves, only to be told who we must become? The Grand Tour is over. But its lesson remains. In a society that demands performance over authenticity, the real courage is not in surviving the journey. It's in returning home, and daring to stay changed. So tell me, if you had everything to lose, your name, your status, your inheritance, would you still follow the road that makes you who you really